In the coffered riches of grammar and declensions, I found Banhus, its fire, benches, wattle and rafters, where the soul fluttered awhile in the roof space. There was a small crock for the brain, and a cauldron of generations swung at the center, love-den, blood-holt, dream-bower. It is time for another words, and we've hit bedrock in our excavation project as we dig back in time through the sedimentary layers of the English language. We started by talking about modern English and how it was formed and the history of it. Then we went back and read some late Middle English or early modern English with the Morte d'Arthur and Mallory. We did some Chaucer, some really high Middle English, some Gawain. Now it's time to turn our attention to the earliest roots of the English language. So then I say we're hitting bedrock. We're really coming up against the oldest forms of English that we know and have. And they come, as I've said now several times throughout this series, from our Germanic past, from these tribes that first conquered in the post-Roman era, first conquered England and Britain, and after whom England is named. Another word for Old English is Anglo-Saxon. And the poem that I read at the beginning is a selection from a poem not by an Old English poet, but by a very contemporary poet, somebody who just died recently, and that's Seamus Heaney, who was one of our great living poets while he lived. And he's one of the best people to read and explore if you are trying to get a feel for what Old English can do for you. You know, I've been suggesting sort of throughout this series that a reason to care about all this fun etymology nerd stuff is that not only is it fascinating, and not only does English have this unique history that we could stand to appreciate and take pride in, but it will also make you a more effective wielder of this tool that you use every day. Because unless you understand how much richness there is in the history of some of these words, you will just toss them off and use them casually. And language is a tool that pays to use with great care and with indeed real awareness, not only because of the harm it can do, but also because of the joy it can bring and what it can do for you in your life, the good things it can help you to do and accomplish. And nowhere is this more true than in the case of Old English, because when we talk about Old English and these Germanic roots, we're talking about some of the most primal words in our language, some of those basic core words, monosyllables like man or lord, bread, loaf, right? These concepts that we just can't get by without, that shape the most rudimentary ways we have of experiencing the world and its universal human aspects. These are, when we get down to talking about the things that we share sort of with every member of the human race, it's through Old English and our Old English roots that experience is mediated for us as speakers of English. And that's something that Heaney really deeply understood. He, throughout his work, was always coming back to this image of digging. In fact, one of his most famous poems is all about digging. This isn't it. This is a poem called Bone Dream, and it's about a reflection that's prompted by finding a bone in the Irish countryside. Heaney had this complicated relationship to English in its modern form because of his sympathy with the Irish cause and also with the urgent awareness of kind of the loss of the Irish language, but also, of course, he was one of the great wielders of English, and in some ways, because he was a critic of British imperialism, or whatever you want to call it, he was also, I think, able to view English from the outside and understand it in this really profound way. And he's often, when he's talking about digging, he's often talking about digging back into the past and the history of the language. He makes all these comparisons between, you know, his father who would dig in the dirt and he who digs in language. And so when I'm talking about, you know, our excavation project, digging back in the past of the language and going through all of these different sedimentary layers, it's really Heaney that I'm inspired by, that I've been drawing from. And he's been in the background. Now he's going to come to the foreground because one of the things he did is he wrote, I think, a really wonderful translation of Beowulf, which is the Old English text that probably most people are most familiar with. If you know about any Old English, it's going to be about Beowulf. And Heaney wrote a translation of it, which I think is really effective, in part because he understood what Old English can do. It's sort of primal power. So in that stanza that I just read, or series of stanzas, he says, "In the coffered riches of grammar and declensions, I found Banhus." So already, right, he's speaking my language. All this idea that the language itself is a kind of treasure house or storehouse with all sorts of words that you never know where they come from, or you're never going to expect that English has a word for this or that. I just the other day, for the first time, learned the word glabrous, which I had literally never heard before. 17th century English word, comes from Latin, meaning hairless, smooth. So if you want to call my dad bald, you can call him glabrous. But here, Heaney is talking about sifting through these coffers and finding banhus, which is a word that means bone house. And you can probably hear those two words that are still alive for us, but that come from Old English. And ban is bone, hus is house, and it means body, which Heaney finds, and I find unbelievably cool. Just such a elegant and beautiful idea that he then spins out in this poetic way. And this is often how poetry works, whether poets realize it or not. It's by spinning out the latent possibilities that are inherent in the metaphors of language, because all language is in some sense a kind of metaphor, a kind of symbolic standing in for one thing for another, and we're always talking in these metaphors even when we don't realize it. Banhus is a beautiful example, and now he's talking about the body as a house of bone for the soul, right? It's fire, benches, wattle, and rafters. There's something so cozy is too condescending a word, but there's something so touching and lovely about the thought of the soul living in its home in the body, where the soul fluttered a while, so maybe more of a temporary way station than a home. In the roof space, there was a small crock for the brain, that is a small little clay pot or some kind of vessel for the brain. That's the skull. And then he goes on in this, I think, very sort of provocative description of basically the private parts, right? The cauldron of generation swung at the center, love den, blood holt, dream bower, and all of these amazing, in fact, Germanic words that he's using, right? Love den, blood holt, so on and so forth. Heaney's extremely aware of this, and he's a guy that has drunk to the lees the intoxicating power of the English language, and just knows how to work with these words in this really wonderful way. And so that's what we're looking at, I think, when we talk about Old English. And up to now, I've been sort of saying, here's how you can read and enjoy texts in their original, even if you're not totally fluent, say, in Middle English. If you read aloud, if you concentrate on pronunciation, if you read carefully and closely and take some care, you can actually get your hands dirty with Morte d'Arthur or with even Chaucer, right? In this case, now we're really moving into a place that is mutually unintelligible. Modern English and Old English are not the same language. They have transitioned over time into different languages. And so for me, the thing that I get most out of Old English, although I do have some interest in it and have worked on it to some degree, what I get most out of it is what Heaney gets out of it, which is these beautiful etymological resonances that are still alive and that you can find in these wonderful words. And if you're interested in this, besides reading Heaney, another thing you can do, I have to recommend to you, it's just too delightful not to pass over and not mention, these books by a guy called Mark Forsyth, who I think is just one of these classic British public intellectuals. I might be wrong. He might be affiliated with an institution, but I think he's what they call an independent scholar who writes these books by basically pawing through British library lexicons and discovering obscure words and etymologies and histories. And there are two books. They sound like big, weighty, difficult books, but they're actually breezy, short reads. One is called the Etymologicon, and that's it's called a circular stroll through the English language. It begins with one etymology, the etymology of the word book, and then it traces that and connects it to other words and other words and other words until it arrives all the way back at the end of, I don't know, something like 200 large print pages to return to the word book. And so he gives you this huge just little tour through all of the resources of English. And then the other one, which is called the Horologicon. So etymologicon, right, is this word that Milton invented to describe an etymological treasury or account, sort of like a dictionary or maybe more like an encyclopedia of etymological resonances. And then the Horologicon comes from a word meaning hour, and it's a book of hours. But it's a book of obscure words for every hour in the day and written with enormous wit. Such a romp. You got to go check it out. So I'll drop the links to all of that in the show notes and everything. But these ways of connecting to Old English can get you a feel, I think, for the way in which our basic human primal experiences are not lost even after all these years, even after all this history. When you're talking about Old English words and when you're talking about the deep history of any language, you are often talking about the most rudimentary human experiences that are sort of shared across the world. And that would stand to reason, right? The first things you need words for are often also the things that everybody knows and talks about: food, bread, people, right? Relationships, mothers, fathers, and so on and so forth. And not all of those words are from Old English with us, but a lot of them are. And so it's almost like a connection to our pagan past in some sense, because these tribes were pagan before they were Christian. They were Christianized under Gregory the Great, really, and Gregory the Gregorian mission. And so very quickly, and including by the time of Beowulf, which is around 1000 AD, you do get a strong Christian sensibility in these Old English texts, but you also get the sort of undercurrent or the like subterranean pagan attitudes. And so one great example of this that you may never have thought about, or maybe you know this, our words for the days of the week are named after these Germanic pagan gods. And what's so beautiful and distinctive about this is it's actually a Greco-Roman system that we have for naming the weeks, in the sense that the days of the week of the weekday are named after the 5 major planets plus the sun and the moon. So you have Sunday, for instance, is one example. And in the Romance languages, which come from Latin, this is much clearer because you have words like vendredi, which come from Venus, or jeudi, which comes from Jove, right? And that's Jupiter. And so the major gods who are associated with the major planets then get associated with major days, and this is part of a kind of vision, a pagan vision of the world in which all things are interconnected in this huge network. That makes its way to England, but it gets basically reskinned with the deities from Germanic paganism that correspond to the deities in the Greco-Roman pantheon. And as I've been talking about on the Tuesday show, there are a lot of those correspondences just always, because paganism isn't like plucked out of nowhere. Paganism is a sort of instinctive, natural, incomplete, but also understandable way of looking at and describing the world that has occurred to basically everybody. And so when you get, for instance, to Monday is easy because Monday's the moon day, right? And that's just our word for moon, and it's lundi in French, lunedi, and so forth. All these Romance languages just come from luna in Latin. But then you get to Tuesday, right? And Wednesday and Thursday. And you say, well, so what's Thursday about? Why is Thursday connected to jeudi, which is the day of Jove and Jupiter? Well, because Thor is the equivalent of Jove and Jupiter in this kind of Norse pantheon, essentially, and this Germanic pantheon. And this, you can make all of these different connections. Tuesday is a great one because Tuesday is the god of war, whose name is Tyr, and so you get Tyr's Day, Tuesday. And it's not that the people who spoke Old English were worshiping these gods. It's just that the history of that place and that connection with these spirits of the world, right? Which, as I've said before, it's easy to kind of attack paganism because paganism is ultimately untrue. It's not Christianity, and so Christians have often been very aggressive toward paganism, but they've also greeted true paganism with a certain respect because it represents the natural heart of man, which needs correction and guidance and all this stuff, but doesn't need to be totally lost or kicked out, and in some ways is finding its way back now into our consciousness for better and also very much for worse. But these primal connections, all I'm saying is they still exist in the language. The fact that you say Friday and not, I don't know, Venus Day is because you come from a tradition and a history and a culture that back before it was Christian worshipped Frigg and not Venus. And those names are still there. They're still present for us. And this is true just everywhere you look, basically, in Old English. We don't actually have that much Old English to go on, which is sort of an interesting thing. We have, I think, David Crystal, the linguist, counted up that we have about 3 novels worth of Old English text, which is a great way of putting it. That's like 3 million words, which sounds like a lot, but it's not that much, given that we have to reconstruct this entire language from it. And so there are all sorts of uncertainties and disputes and disagreements within scholarship of Old English about what certain things mean. We don't totally fully understand everything, but we understand a whole lot by its relationship to English, but also to German and to a number of other languages, and also through, connections with Latin and so forth. And so we've got, some things like the books of hours, like these daily texts that tell us more about what life was, but we've also got our great legendarium, right? Our legends and our thought world of the legendary universe contained in these Old English texts. That's why Beowulf was so magnificent and revelatory when it was discovered, and why it was incredibly powerful for guys like J.R.R. Tolkien, who also wrote a translation of Beowulf, which I'm going to read to you from today. And the whole concept that this was a relic from Christian England that nevertheless carried forth and visibly contains within it all of this yearning and longing for an ancestral past that was pagan, and that had a certain roughness to it, but also a nobility and an honor. And this is why, for instance, when you read guys like C.S. Lewis, they say, like, if anything, if Christianity is in decline, then the problem is that we're not pagan enough, because paganness is something that Christians can sort of work with, right? This noble sense that there are obligations to valor in the world, that we live in a universe that has consciousnesses in it that are higher than our own. Like, all of this is sort of intimation of truths, and there's like remnants here of the infancy, really, of our language and of our culture and of our past. So without further ado, I'm just going to get right into it and read to you a passage from the opening of Beowulf. And I believe I've read to you this passage a couple times before, but we're going to just revisit it first in Old English. Once again, in this domain, you guys have led me on this wonderful journey, but I am not coming to you from a place of expertise. So you can look up, and I will drop links to some places where you can hear people who do know all about this stuff reading aloud. I may make mistakes. I have spent some time with this particular passage, and I just think it really pays to hear it because it's so lovely. And then I'm going to talk about a few different elements of it before I read you some translations. So here we go. Opening of Beowulf. HWÆT Wegardena injar dagum feud kuninge thrimje frunon hudha ethelingas ellen fremedon oft shield shaving sheden athreatum monogum megthum mea dosetla ofter exode erlas sithan erest where the feeshaft funden he das frovre bad werks under wolknum werth mundum tha or that him agulch thara im sitindra offer hronrada huran shoulder gomban yildan. That was God König. So one of the things about Old English that can be so lovely is that the meaning can sometimes flicker in and out, like through the fog, because there's a lot here that is really difficult to know what to do with if you don't already know some of these words. Feod Köninge, Thrimje Frunon is probably not something you can naturally recognize. You can recognize something we've been talking about throughout, which is this alliterative style, right? And translations that I love will preserve this or try to get some of it in there. All that him agulch thara im sitindra over hronrada huran, right? Gomban yildan, those are both G's. That was God König. But then at the end, that was God König, you can maybe hear what that sound is, and it's beautifully simple, but also powerful and noble. That was a good king. This is about Scyld Sheafson, who's kind of the originary hero that leads on, in his legacy leads on to the beginning of the story. The whole thing begins with this wonderful word that's great to know and even more fun to say at parties when you want to get everybody's attention. You just stand up on a table, you pound your beer stein on the counter, and you say, "What?" Which is one of these words that not everybody totally knows exactly what it means. It's obvious what it's supposed to do, and that is to get your attention, to invite you to listen in to the legend of Beowulf, but it seems to be basically the ancestor of our word what, and you can see it's just got the W and the H backwards. It's HW rather than WH, but it's what. But it's in this case, it's what in the sense of maybe from Shakespeare, what ho, what have you, right? And the closest thing maybe in modern English, although this wouldn't be a good translation, is like when you have in hip hop culture, people used to go, oh, what, right? Like they would say something, someone would say something amazing, and you go, what? Like pay attention to that, right? So people translate this as like low, listen, hark, so on and so forth. But there's nothing like the power of it in the original, what. And that's why even if you don't fully understand the words, it's great to get a side-by-side translation, look at what the rules are for pronunciation, and just read it aloud and kind of enjoy some of these sounds. I love Ofer Hronrada. This is one of these words I wish we had kept. Hronrada means the whale road, and it's a wonderful epithet for the sea. So just as Homer and the great ancestral poets of the Greeks would invent these decorative descriptions of the natural world, so we too have this history also. Hronrada is a beautiful one, over the whale road. And then a word that we've been tracking throughout that I just want to now bring to its final conclusion is the word wax. And I've read to you various different instances of this word wax in a number of different texts. It endures right up to this day. We say the moon waxes when it gets bigger. And in the text I read to you from the King Arthur legends, the Morte d'Arthur, we heard about a queen who waxed greater and greater. She got bigger and bigger as she got pregnant. So obviously this has to do with increase and with growth, but we also have seen examples of it where it means not so much physical growth, but change or movement in a certain direction, right? And we still, it's a little archaic, but we still say you could wax poetic, you can wax philosophical, and this doesn't mean that you put a philosophical wax gloss over yourself. It means that you grow more and more in this direction. And so this core concept of growth is sort of ramifying out, separating out into all these different meanings in the later development of the language. And here we have it sort of in its primal form when we hear that this young man waxed under the clouds. That's what Wolknum is, or the heavens, sort of the firmament, maybe. And this is where we get our word welkin, which again is archaic, but when you see it in Shakespeare, it can feel like, I always thought, when I was like first reading Shakespeare, I thought that a welkin was an article of clothing, I guess, because it sounds like other articles of clothing, but a welkin just means the sky, and it comes from this Wolknum root. And so he waxed under the sky, which is just a lovely way of saying he grew up. And he grew up in every possible way, right? He grew in strength, he grew in wisdom, he grew physically in stature. It's something like what we get also, I believe, in the Gospels, although I'm pulling this out of my hat, so tell me, write in and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think we get something about Jesus basically growing in stature and authority and ability. And this is a topos that recurs throughout the history of various different languages, but here we have it with this core idea of waxing, which will persist all the way up to the modern day, where the waxing of the moon, and with waxing poetic and so forth. Wax under Wolknum. Gorgeous. Also, not English, you may have noticed, right? So what do we do with translation? This is a beautiful and weird situation where we have to translate our own language into our own language. And there's questions that translators always face with something foreign and strange, whether to, as some people have put it, whether to draw the reader closer to the text, that is to say, make us feel and experience the strange world of this other time, this other place, through the eyes of this ancient or old piece of writing. And that would mean coming up with a modern English version that doesn't sound like people talking in the modern day, that is not, it wouldn't, I don't think, be appropriate to translate this as like, and in fact, there was a terrible translation that came out that began with bro, right? Tell me we still know how to talk about kings, or something like that. And that's not appropriate because it gets the aggressiveness of the text and the lapidary power of it, but not the sort of elevation and mysticism of it. But you may not want to go like full archaizing, and you may to some extent want to bring the text to the reader, which is to say move it a little bit more toward our way of speaking. And you obviously have to do that to some extent because you have to put it in language that people can understand. But I want to read to you two different translations, the Heaney translation and the J.R.R. Tolkien translation, because they take two very different approaches to how this works. So Same 10 lines. Here we go. I think it's 10 lines. Same opening passage. He writes, "So, the spear Danes in days gone by and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. There was Shield Sheafson, scourge of many tribes, a wrecker of mead benches, rampaging among foes. This terror of the hall troops had come far. A foundling to start with, he would flourish later on as his powers waxed and his worth was proved. In the end, each clan on the outlying coasts beyond the Whale Road had to yield to him and begin to pay tribute. That was one good king." So you see that Heaney does bring the poem into something like modern diction, but he does it with such sensitivity because he, among all people, really understood this through line that runs right back down to the base of the language, right? That goes all the way into Old English. And so he was able, I think, to wield modern English in a way that revealed or uncovered some of its Old English roots. And especially it has to do with this thudding and almost stoic or laconic tone that he takes, right? That was one good king. And there are these wonderful instances of alliteration. He gets the what he does with wax is really great. He would flourish later on as his powers waxed and his worth was proved. This is an example of a time when a short phrase in the original, in the source language, werks under Wolknum, has to be kind of unpacked, spiraled out into this larger series of ideas and words. That's some classic thing that happens in transition to the target language. But then, right, just these there's so many beautiful flourishes in here. It's also true, and I'm reading right now a wonderful book by Umberto Eco called Mouse or Rat, in which he talks about translation as negotiation. And this is Thomas Sowell talks about how everything's a trade-off, right? And so everything in translation is a trade-off, right? Every language has a unique set of attributes and characteristics. You're going to preserve some, you're going to emphasize some, and the words that you use in the target language aren't always going to have all the same characteristics. You have to decide which ones to emphasize. Here we've definitely got that feeling of simplicity, clarity, forthright directness, martial vigor, manly simplicity. What we don't have so much is the sense of solemn drama and high adventure. And that's because you can't really do both anymore in English, or at least it's harder to do both than it was in Old English. Now here's Tolkien, who has much more of that taste for the kind of archaizing flair of the high adventure, right? And he says, lo. So already, so is a very understated way to translate HWÆT. Lo would be on the other end of the spectrum, right? Very grand gesture to open the poem. Lo, the glory of the kings of the people of the Spear Danes in days of old, we have heard tell, how those princes did deeds of valor. Oft shield shaving, robbed the hosts of foemen, many peoples of the seats where they drank their mead, laid fear upon men, he who first was found forlorn, comfort for that he lived to know, mighty grew under heaven, throve in honor, until all that dwelt nigh about, over the sea where the whale rides, must hearken to him and yield him tribute. A good king was he. So here we preserve a sense that this is where the Arthurian spirit comes from, and that's very beautiful and illuminating. We also get a lot more alienated from the text, right? The word order that he keeps is sort of strange. The glory in days gone by, in days of old, we have heard tell. We get a feeling for the alliteration, which is great, right? He who first was found forlorn. I think that comes through more strongly in Tolkien's version. But we also get less of that sense of simplicity. We get more of an ornate feeling, which isn't so much in the original, although, you know, in Tolkien's favor, there is a degree of kind of ornamentation in words like whale road and so forth, or as he puts it, over the sea where the whale rides, which I think is really lovely, although in that instance, I think I kind of prefer beyond the whale road, just because it gets the feeling, the sound of over Hronrada. So this is both a really lovely illustration of kind of the problems that translators might face and the things you might consider as you choose a translation yourself, but also I think just two different but totally equally beautiful ways of connecting to Old English and bringing forth some of its power in modern English so that the glory of days gone by doesn't fade. I mean, that's the point of poetry, right? Is to revive these ancient ancestral memories, or at least in part, is to revive these sort of latent potentialities that have been buried under the history of our language and of our culture. I just think this stuff is so beautiful and kind of needful when the world is so disenchanted, right? We always complain about modernity and how there's no magic in it and how we're all these kind of bugmen or whatever the online term is, slogging through this life in cubicles. Well, one way to kind of get beyond that, and one way that I think people are discovering, is to vitalize, to revive, right, these ancient glories. Because the secret is, the trick is, that even our forefathers in the glorious days of yore were also drawing their noble aspirations from a golden age gone by. And we see that in this poem, right? This is a hearkening back in around the 11th century AD to much earlier, maybe say 6th century AD, adventures and exploits. And that is kind of a beautiful thing to contemplate, that even though we feel as if all the magic has gone out of the world, we're always in the position of drawing magic from the past, because the world is, of course, perennially traveling away from, but also back toward its divine home. And this is a concept for another day, but a great reason to go and read a version of Beowulf, either the Tolkien or the Heaney. I might favor the Heaney just a little bit. I'm like Team Heaney slightly on this one. Sorry, Tolkien bros. But let me know, actually, which one you enjoy, if you have read them or if you go away and read them. This concludes our series on the English language, at least for now, in Words, Words, Words. But we're totally all in on this on like words generally now. I started it kind of as I had a couple questions I wanted to answer. Now I've got a bunch. Please send me more. Please write in if you've got questions about the English language or any other language, or translation more generally, the nature of language. I'm absolutely loving this, and thank you guys for going with me. I've learned a lot and enjoyed a lot this journey through the English language. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.